In her paper, Girls, Boys and Junior Sexualities, Exploring Children's Gender and Sexual Relations in the Primary School, Professor Emma Renold quotes academic Richard Johnson. Queer theory is linked to forms of politics which deliberately seek to break down the fixed boundaries between the hetero-homo, gender and other binaries to multiply sexual categories and ultimately dissolve them. In the same paper, she also writes, queering childhood involves not just the queering of sexual binary oppositions, such as male and female, but also the generational binaries, adult and child. Queer theory is being pushed into Welsh education. It is also being pushed into the Welsh Health Service. In an article for Pulse, the online magazine for general practitioners, Dr Sophie Quinney, clinical lead at the Welsh Gender Service, describes her typical day. 8 a.m, the kettle is on and I'm checking the new GP referrals. I support prescribing for gender-diverse people across Cardiff and the Vale, but also further afield in Wales, where endocrine support is unavailable. We are shortly launching a DES to incentivise GPs to prescribe long-term maintenance HRT. 9 a.m, it's time for clinic. Patients each have a 30-minute slot. Each one of these patients tells a different story of battling to be their authentic selves, and at times feeling let down by their GP. 4:30 p.m. The kettle is back on and the Welsh cakes are warmed. Nick from the charity Umbrella Cymru is helping with a proposal for peer support, people with lived experience, to provide a community presence at the new Cardiff Gender Identity Clinic. 9 p.m. Bedtime reading is Transgender Health, the practitioner's guide to binary and non-binary trans patient care by Dr Ben Vincent, which I recommend to all GPs. Nick Lewis from Umbrella Cymru describes himself as a queer theorist. In a post on Reddit, Ben Vincent describes himself as a non-binary academic sociologist specialising in trans healthcare. He writes, my PhD was non-binary gender identity negotiations, interactions with queer communities and medical practice. Vincent's PhD was supervised by Sally Hines, a gender studies professor with some controversial views. Hines took part in a discussion with Professor Kathleen Stock in a Woman's Hour programme in 2018.
Right, Sally, in simple terms, I'm starting this one with you. What are sex and gender?
Okay, so sex, I would argue, is a very complex mix of chromosomes, hormones and genitals. So we are talking about biological factors, but we're not talking about anything at all which is straightforward. So we're talking about a complex mix of factors which, especially in the West, have often been seen through a binary framework. So sex then is believed...
hang on. Binary framework.
Okay, so sex is believed to divide people into two categories of male or female.
Go on.
Okay, so, and gender is the way in which a society understands or experiences these sex differences. Again, in the West, these have largely been understood until quite recent times in terms of a binary framework, so male and female.
When a baby is born, the first thing that happens, anyone who's had a baby will know this, the first thing that happens is, obviously you ascertain that it's all right, and then you find out its biological sex.
Yep. I mean, I think using the term assigned female or male at birth, okay, rather than male or female at birth is a really useful way of kind of looking at the ways in which sex can be understood as something social. So what's that's doing then is arguing, is kind of pointing to the ways in which someone, usually a doctor in this instance, is making a decision. They're making a presumption about what sex that baby is. And as we've seen with intersex, that's clearly not always the case.
Okay, I think a lot of people will take issue, including, I suspect, Kathleen. So off you go, Kathleen, tell us.
Well, I agree that we're increasingly good at understanding intersex variations, so disorders of sexual development, and a very, very small number, a subset of people with those disorders are atypical chromosomally, and sometimes for a very small number of particular disorders, namely AIS and CAH, you might get a XY male with a feminized genitalia, or you might get an XX female with a virilized genitalia. So that's not the 1.7% of people we're always being told are intersex. That's a very, number. Very, very small number, like 1 in 20,000, I think, for CAH. And but it's I think the wrong way to think of it, that a doctor looks at a child, a neonate, and says, okay, I'm going to assign a sex. What they do is they do genetic testing and blood testing, and they work out which variety of disorder this child has. And then there's a standard for, the vast majority of intersex children, there's an absolutely standard route into recording male or female
but as you
sex.
say, this simply
it may not be standard.
It isn't a common problem, this, is it?
It's not happens, a common problem.
We know it does.
But it's also sometimes in the rhetoric of sex as a spectrum and the assigning of sex as if it's a social decision on behalf of the doctor, it's to gloss over the medical procedures that are pretty well understood now, which result in predictable outcomes for whether this child is going to be counted as male or female.
And just to say that it doesn't affect very many people, or it's a minority problem or disorder, I think is kind of, that's ignoring the way that lots of young people now are experiencing their lives, their sense of gender, as something which is non-binary, which is neither male nor female.
Okay, I can see that you're struggling with that, Kathleen. Very briefly, if you can.
Well, we've moved there. Sally's moved there from talking about a medical issue to a social issue, and whether young people feel non-binary or not, that's got absolutely nothing to do with intersex. Those two things are completely distinct.
Quinney and Vincent wrote the Gender Diversity and Trans Health training modules issued by Health, Education and Improvement Wales and available for all healthcare professionals in Wales. Ben Vincent is non-binary. Ben Vincent is autistic. Stella O'Malley and Sasha Ayad discuss the appeal of gender identity ideology to the autistic mind.
These days, this obsession with labels and categories and where do you fit, and theories, that's meat and drink to their mind. They're like, oh great, let me study all the categories and I'll agonize over them and then I'll find them, and then I will be nicely labelled,
yes,
and correctly labelled, and that satisfies my mind, and I'm anxious until I get it.
Yeah,
and so it's made for it. It's almost like I would say that this entire kind of movement is pretty much custom built for somebody who's on the spectrum. That it takes on the obsessive interest, the categories, all the kind of different explanations and frameworks to go with all the categories. This is their festival. It's exactly how their brain works.
A Stonewall Cymru role model is Selena Caemawr, an activist, entrepreneur, writer and founder of the Aubergine Cafe. Selena identifies as non-binary. Selena is autistic. She explains what gender means to her.
So I want to talk about gender because I remember in a talk you said that gender was for neurotypical people, and I really love that. So I'd love you if you could tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
It is a big one. A lot of us, I'm going to speak generically sometimes, a lot of autistic people feel as though gender is something that kind of eludes them somewhat. And actually, I think some research just came out recently about this. I'll have to hook you up with that. So gender is something that kind of eludes us. In our society, it's like gender is a set of rules, a set of social rules that have been decided for us. Like, this is how you should behave and so on. I don't know if you've ever told an autistic person how they should be or shouldn't be. If they're like, no, I'm not like that. Well, it doesn't often go down very well. And quite often I think it's because a lot of these social rules don't make sense. They don't make sense to us. So how can we tangibly perceive our gender when our experiences don't match up with these societal rules that have been set up? So, yeah, I think it's something I love to say is like, it's like, yeah, I think that's a you problem. Like, that's not me. I don't have an issue with my gender and who I am as a person. The issue I have is how I fit into the society. Now, I am very concerned that, like, if some people were to hear me say this, they'd be like, aha, see, gender is a social construct where you should just be who you are and live with it and not want to change your body and so on. And that's not what I'm saying, because the context is this. We live in the society where these rules exist, right? And we have to learn to live in it. If I may use an analogy, at Aubergine Cafe, we don't really subscribe to a sort of like capitalist hierarchical kind of structure there. However, we have to support our community to learn to live within a capitalist structure, because that's where we live. And if we don't learn that, they don't survive. Right? They need to learn how to take care of themselves, how to perhaps get a job, pay their rent, and all of these things, because that's how we survive. We live in a world where we have these social gender norms, and they're different all around the world as well, which is another reason why it doesn't make sense, because why would it be different around the world otherwise? But we have to learn to live here. And if we can help people to become freer versions of themselves by removing some of these barriers and fears and like really like painful situations that we're in where we don't fit into society, we can't change the society. So just allow us to kind of do things. I really believe in bodily autonomy. I really believe that, you know, we should be able to be informed and choose what we want to do with our bodies.
A counter-argument, of course, is that changing one's body to fit in with social stereotypes reinforces those very social stereotypes. Dr. Simon Braybrook is a GP working in Butetown medical practice, a practice that on its website describes itself as LGBT-friendly and always trans-affirming. Braybrook wrote a glowing review of Vincent's book. As a GP, I would highly recommend this book to my colleagues. This is a sensitive and well-researched, highly accessible guide to an area of care which is becoming increasingly important. We're in need of more formalised training for GP trainees in this area, and I am sure this book could quickly become the main recommended text. Braybrook is lead GP for the Cardiff and Vale UHB gender team that will prescribe long-term maintenance HRT for transgender patients. The Clinical Advisory Network on Sex and Gender, CAN-SG, are a coalition of clinicians who are sceptical of the gender affirmative model pushed by queer theorists. On their website they state, "We believe the sexed categories of male and female encompass all expressions of gender, personality types and behaviours." CAN-SG have arranged a conference for March 2024 to be held at the Royal College of General Practitioners. Activists put pressure on the RCGP to cancel the conference. In the comments section of the article published in Pulse, the majority of GPs were against the cancellation. Simon Braybrook was a dissenting voice. He wrote, "I fully respect the rights of this group and any other to speak. However, looking at this conference, I don't see it having the full representation and inclusion of trans people, especially trans youth and their families, and do feel they are presenting a negative slant on transition. As a result, I don't want any part of it, and so, by association, don't want any part in the RCGP." Dr. Dylan Summers replied, Simon, it may be true that this conference does not represent both sides of the gender theory versus gender critical debate. However, I can't help noticing that the mandatory training I've been given around gender did not represent both sides of the debate. It included no suggestion that it might be valid for a clinician to hold a gender-critical position. I get the impression that this event is a lone dissenting voice in a healthcare ecology that appears to have officially adopted a gender theory view. To criticise it for not giving weight to the prevalent view is unreasonable. Simon Braybrook is autistic. In a tweet, Ben Vincent wrote, I rarely log into Twitter, and this is difficult to say, but due to my health I have left my job, and I'm no longer engaging in any academic activity. This is either an indefinite hiatus or the end to my career. This account will only be checked sporadically. The account has now been deleted.